over the drive towards greater economic liberalization and globalization that we have seen really over the last 30 to 40 years. So I think we are at a moment of very high risk. That risk has obviously crystallized partly during the pandemic and the perception across the world that one needed to focus much more heavily on the resilience and controllability and national control over supply chains. But I do think obviously the problem goes much deeper than that. We can come on, no doubt, to the question of potential China-US conflict and the intense difficulty in China-US relations, which are probably at their worst ebb for 40 or 50 years, probably since the opening up of China in the early 1970s. On Russia-Ukraine, if we'd sat here a year ago, we wouldn't have predicted a war of the intensity and scale that we've seen. We probably also wouldn't have predicted that 11 months into that war, there is more momentum on the Ukrainian side, probably, than the Russian. I would have to give to this audience a pretty realistic perspective on the war. I don't think there is a prospect of this war ending anytime soon. This has been a profound shock in Europe and no doubt beyond Europe, but particularly in Europe, I would say. We've not seen war on this scale. Obviously, in the early 1990s, there was a war in the former Yugoslavia and the Balkans, where the death toll was extremely high. But if you look, for example, at Russian losses in the last 11 months, they're probably running, according to American figures, at something close to 200,000 either dead or wounded. When you compare Russian losses during a 10-year Afghan war of about 10 to 15,000, we're probably looking at comparable scale losses on the Ukrainian side. I only say that because in Europe, maybe naively, particularly on the part of the European Union, there had been a perception that we'd moved into a postmodern world where conflict of the sort that we've seen over the last 12 months was no longer possible and no longer viable. And actually this is an old-fashioned war. Obviously we're seeing modern components of this war and all the kind of drone warfare, the use of AI. It's not just classic Second World War, but an awful lot of what we're seeing in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine reminds people of the run-up to both the First World War and the Second World War. And I can't say I'm optimistic sitting here now that this war is about to end anytime soon. If you're President Putin, let's be honest, I think he made a major miscalculation about the reaction both from the United States and from the European Union, and assumes that there would be much less intensive resistance from Ukraine than he has suffered. He's now in a very difficult position with the extent of the losses for Russian forces. But I don't see that leading to any peace overtures or any early end to the war.
Sir Ivan, if you don't mind, please leave it up here because I'll come back to you on that issue. Sure. So let me move to Farah, to Ms. Pandith. The other thing that, it's become a topic of discussion, especially in Asia, is about the geopolitical tension between US and China. And this is really a contentious issue because Asian countries, I don't think we have the luxury to choose between US or China. But maybe not many of us understand about the root of the problem. So if you can share your view, what is the US perspective from this tension between US and China, and perhaps you can also add about maybe the changing of the social change in the US that also somehow instigate the sentiment against against China or something like that. That will be something that will be very useful for us.
Well, I would like to first of all say good morning to everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me here. And this is a really important question to discuss. I want to just pick up from a couple of things that Sir Ivan said, and looking at context. We are in an unprecedented moment, okay? All of the risks and analysis that we have done that takes us to the point that we are Some have been really spot on, and that's more along the lines of traditional threats that we've seen. But there is a whole set of things that no one was forecasting, no one was thinking about. And I want to just sort of set the table with that because I think it is really important to sort of understand this particular moment. And from the United States perspective, it is really important to see that because I think that what you're seeing from the Biden administration is a recalibration about the world that we're living in, a world that is very importantly connected with things that are happening offline, but also increasingly things that are happening online that change the way a country feels, the sentiment that's taking place. Misinformation and disinformation are parts of warfare that our adversaries are deploying in ways that we had not quite predicted, nor did we predict the ways in which societies would respond. So why is that important? That's important because when we look at all of the tools in our toolbox that allow all of you to forecast what's coming next, this societal component is often not one that is put into the mix. And so when you ask rightly what's happening in America, all of this positions us in terms of what is happening with U.S.-China relations. As Sir Ivan said, we are in a moment that we've never seen before. Secretary Blinken is heading out to China, as you all know, to reinforce I would say, the person-to-person infrastructure that we really need to revamp, to send a signal internationally that the United States and China can conduct itself in traditional norms, even though things are quite serious. President Biden has released a national security strategy that talks about two very specific pillars. One is that America is going to compete in the world that is coming. So we are looking ahead. We're thinking not just about this one or two generations, but we're looking farther down the line. We're also looking at shared threats that we all face. So with this, you look at the way the Biden administration has positioned us vis-a-vis China. You look at an agenda that is about protecting what America is and what we want to do. We want to shed any resilience to China. We are looking at new laws and new norms. First time in decades that we're looking at federal laws that are going to change the way people can share information with China. We are sort of on the manufacturing side and certainly chip diplomacy. But also, really importantly, this is one of the most important bipartisan issues that is happening in America. And interestingly, there are lessons from the Ukraine war that make a difference to the way America is, in my view, looking at China. Because if we can see what Russia can do to supply chains, the positioning is what could China do if we were to get into a hot mess moving down. So all of these things sort of create a new feeling for U.S.-China relations. We are looking at a rebuilding of American infrastructure in a new way, a repositioning of the way in which we are looking at China, and then finally, my final point, and then I'll stop, is what you have heard from the Obama administration onward, which is the Indo-Pacific is really important to America. Secretary Lloyd, who was our Secretary of Defense, has gone to the Indo-Pacific, I think, 6 times thus far. We are rebuilding and reacclimating this new sort of positioning where we are reinforcing diplomacy at every turn. We're looking at treaties and seeing how we can reinforce them. And this is very important. We are also looking at every tool in our toolbox that we haven't yet used before. So where are places that America can rekindle relationships or reinforce relationships in the Indo-Pacific? You're seeing America talk about new embassies that they're going to put forward. Fiji is one example. You're looking at the Quad relationship. You're looking at a relationship between Australia and Great Britain. So all of this to say, while America can talk about this new era of U.S.-China relationships, we are doing a lot to rethink and rebuild our strength and our positioning in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. I'll come back to you later on about related to this issue is about the identity politics. because the implication to the global. So let me now ask you, Pak Trian, against this backdrop, this is not an easy time for us, yeah, because Indonesia is known as a country, with the principle of what is non-aligned movement. So we continue to support the multilateralism. You are a multilateral guy, yeah. So how do you see, this diplomacy process under this global fragmentation, the geopolitical tension? How do you see the Indonesia's position on this? If you can share with us, this will be something that very, very important.
Thank you very much, Pak Chatib. One thing that I would like to start with is that, taking the cue from Farah and Saraifan here, is that I like to give an example that when we have this title of prevailing over turbulence, and sometimes we tend to look at it, we are in turbulence water, but there are some countries that are still using cruise ship, enjoying their life, while others are in lifeboat. And that's where the multilateralism is under attack. You mentioned about this vaccine nationalism as well as other, but we learned from this experience. Luckily, after the pandemic, people started to work together, trying to collaborate and looking at things differently. And then you have the Ukraine crisis, in a sense. And that's also changed the way people think. I mean, the policymakers, even diplomats, everybody was caught off guard. And even people are still thinking in the old days that, look, if you have a local conflict, like in the Vietnam War, it's secluded into a certain neighbor that is affected. But when you talk about the Ukraine issues, the world has changed dramatically. And now everyone is impacted. We are not parties to the conflict, but every countries are impacted. And that goes to the question of the toolbox itself. Before, you used only naval blockade in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now you have so many sanctions, you have the financial sanction, you have the SWIFT, you have a lot of asset freezing, movement of person, all those kind of things. And that comes to my conclusion when we look at the geopolitics as Indonesia, as a country, is that, and this is what I'm trying to tell all the economists in this room, that you need to really rethink your economic modeling. Before, when you want to make a policy decision to invest in a country, you look at the numbers, the GDP growth, the labors, everything, and the domestic policies. But no one calculated and put into variables the foreign policies variables. This is very important. For instance, in the case of Indonesia, we are a country that are non-aligned. We are a country that has never been involved in any military pact. We are a country that a nice guy, if I may say so. This is a place where we can invest. I'm doing a little bit of promotion here, by the way. But really, it's a fact of life. Because our foreign policies, we may change government, but our foreign policy will still be consistent because it's in our constitution of 1945. We can change government anytime, Farah, in Indonesia. But we still are consistent on rules. We are principled in our foreign policy. We do not pick friends. We have all the friends in the world. We have an adagium that we have 0 enemy and 1,000 friends. And that's why when one project, make an economic projection, you have to look at it, first of all, on our international country international commitments, and how you make sure that you also implement that. I'll give a simple example. In the case of climate change, we are one out of 39 countries that have improved, strengthened our national determined commitments on climate change, out of 169 countries. And we continue to policies on green, policies on a lot of things, including what the President mentioned on EVs and others. So what I'm trying to say, to sum up, Pak Chatib, is that when one makes an investment decision, nowadays, you have to calculate how does one particular country project their international relation, how does they implement their international commitments, and that should be factoring in every decision on investment. So come to Indonesia, invest in Indonesia.
Thank you, Pak Trian. Thank you very much. I just want to give a disclaimer as a former chairman of the investment board. Investing in Indonesia is very dangerous because it is addictive. So let me continue our conversation, Sir Ivan. You mentioned about this global fragmentation. I'm going to ask you, this is a $6 million question, but I do believe that all the participants would like to hear your view on this. How do you see, what will be the end game of this Russia-Ukraine war? Because everyone are waiting. This will have the implication for the energy prices, food prices, economic growth, etc. I know this is a tough question, a tricky question, but if you can share your view with us.
Sure. It's an impossible question, in all honesty, but I'll do my best to give it some sort of answer to it. I think we need to start with what's changed, what's gone wrong, and the dimensions of the problem. The optimism that many of us had, I was a relatively young official at the time, in the 1990s with the demise of the Soviet Union, the emergence of a different Russia, at the same time as we were negotiating over an extensive period, and I was involved in those negotiations from the European Union side with getting the Chinese into the WTO, the creation of a rules-based multilateral system that was genuinely global. There was much more optimism in the early to mid-90s, right up to the end of the 90s, it seemed to me, about a genuinely global framework for dealing with global issues that required global legitimacy. And of course that led to the G20. You guys did a fantastic job in the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances on the G20 presidency to keep the show on the road and to deliver any tangible outcomes and deliverables, and it's a huge credit to you. But we founded the G20 early on in this century precisely because the G7, which has existed for 25, 30 years before then, no longer had legitimacy in handling global issues. The difficulty on the relationship with Russia, which has been worsening, let's be honest, for 20 years, and we can all reflect on what Western policy got wrong about Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and you can all reflect on the reasons why Russia, far from turning into anything that looked remotely like a liberal democracy, turned into what we've got today, and we have to face the pretty horrible reality that it's a deeply authoritarian and deeply corrupt society. There's a lot of blame to go round on that, but in the earlier crises that we faced with President Putin, we think of Georgia in 2008, we think even of Crimea in 2014. I was based in Brussels negotiating the sanctions packages against the Russians for the action over Crimea. But nevertheless, at that point, however difficult relations were, within the G20, beyond the G20, bilaterally with prime ministers I was working for and chancellors in Germany and French presidents, there was nevertheless a capacity to have a personal relationship and to keep some sort of diplomatic track going. It failed largely, the Minsk process dominated by the French and Germans. That process has, with this invasion of Ukraine, essentially come to an end. There were some brief attempts by President Macron early in this war to keep a line going to President Putin and to keep talking. Essentially, there's now very little mileage in that, very little appetite, and if you look at the incentives on European politicians, let alone American politicians, the reality is the incentive is to give more and more military support and more sophisticated military support to Ukraine. So the reason why your question is impossible is I see this situation much more likely to escalate over the next few weeks and months than to get better. At the moment, there's a European Union-Ukraine summit later this week. It's extraordinary the extent to which the European Union has committed itself to the idea that Ukraine has a European vocation and would ultimately join the European Union. That would never have happened, even 5 years ago, and would have been regarded as something, outlandish in European terms. But you've seen a progressive shift in European sentiment which says Russia is no longer a viable and reliable partner. Look at what the European Union is having to do to strengthen its own energy security, and by European standards it's moving extremely fast to diversify its sources of supply on oil and gas, to move much faster on renewables. Obviously it makes its own commitment to net zero and to try and tackle climate change. But in the short term, it's taking some really radical steps, essentially to free itself of all dependency on Russia. Now, where is the end game on that? The difficulty with that is if you're the Russians, you're in a very beleaguered situation. The Russian economy is in a mess. That mess is likely to get worse. That may lead to all manner of kind of hidden unrest inside the Russian system, but it also leads to destitution and poverty, and that's quite unlikely to lead to a sort of viable Russian policy. So it's a very gloomy scene. I mean, sooner or later, we have to come to some sort of negotiating table which enables people to not only to settle this dispute, but for the entire kind of Western world, by which I mean the United States and the European Union, the UK, and some others, to come to some sort of accommodation with Russia which delivers a genuine partnership. But I have to stress, we're miles off that. You know, relations with Russia have not been this bad since the Cold War, and actually there were greater mechanisms for managing the Russian relationship during the Cold War than we have today. So we're in a very, very difficult situation. I see the war, as I say, likely to escalate over the next few weeks and months, because I think the Ukrainians, powered by the kinds of weaponry they're now getting from the Western world, including from Europeans who were reluctant at the outset of the war to do that, the Ukrainians will think that they can make very significant ground, I think, in the war in the next 6 months, maybe in the south, maybe in the east of Ukraine. So there's no end in sight of this. I can see from an Indonesian perspective, and not just an Indonesian perspective, why that's deeply alarming, but I don't think we're facing an early end to this conflict.
Okay. Thank you, Sir Ivan. So let me continue to you, Ms. Pandith. You mentioned about, you know, some of the ingredients that perhaps have this root in the United States, and this will lead us to the discussion into the identity politics. Maybe this has to do also with the domestic politics, yeah. And then my question to you is, I believe that if you're talking about leaders and politicians, let me quote what Jean-Claude Juncker said. We all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. Yeah. Then my question is, based on your experience, you're looking about this geopolitical tension, you know, propelled by this identity politics, maybe sentiment against Asian, so many issues in the United States. How do you see this problem may become serious in the US and will affect the foreign policy in the future?
Listen, the United States, it's no surprise, everybody in this audience is very, you know, you're watching internal craziness in our country in a way that even Americans don't understand, right? We are looking at a very challenging situation politically between Republicans and Democrats. We just this morning, the reporting about Biden speaking to his Republican lead in the Senate. It's very difficult. You're also watching a lot of very challenging issues, domestic issues that are taking place around things that make life comfortable in America. How you feel as an American walking down the street. Do you feel safe? Just very basic things we're discussing in new ways. What books are in the library? These are things that were never national conversation issues, but they are today. Why? Because through the last decade, we've seen an increase. Certainly, I should actually go back more than a decade. I would actually say that in a post-9/11 world, the conversation in America around where you came from, what religion you practice, what you look like, everything that is different has become front and center. Add to that the toxic mix of how data affects people, especially young people, and how they think about themselves. So with a swish of their finger, they are able to connect to people who look like them, think like them, believe the things that they believe. If I was to ask your audience, how many of you have children or grandchildren that are looking down at their device at all moments in time, how much of it do you actually know what they do? And I'm not here to give you a lecture on digital hygiene. I'm simply saying that there are malign actors that influence our younger generations. And why is that important to the question you asked? Because in America today, we are seeing in a post-9/11 and then post-January 6th world a huge increase in the risks around domestic terrorism. We are seeing far-right groups, neo-Nazis and others, who are building ideological armies and reshaping the conversation in America. So when you ask this question to me, all of this matters to the shape and the form of how we think about people overseas. Now let me get very specific about Asia. We have a country that is the most diverse nation on planet Earth. And it is something that most Americans are unbelievably proud of. Our history, however, as you well know, is very complicated and not always easy to confront. Certainly, we can look back to the way in which European origin Americans treated those of Asian descent that go back to the very founding of our country, very early days with Black Americans and Asian Americans. Why am I giving you this history lesson? Because what I'm about to say is not new, but it got rebooted and re-injected into the mainstream after the pandemic hit. We had a president that began to speak in language that began an us versus them. You began to see a huge spike in anti-Asian hate in our country. No matter what kind of Asian background you had, if you, quote, looked Asian, you were looked at differently. This matters. This matters to the way in which the conversation takes place around what's happening in Asia, who Asians are, what religions they practice, how they are. And so you're smart to ask that question. But what is critical for all of you as you think about the domestic shape of America and how we think about things, keep your eye on the issue of these things that we don't always talk, the invisible things that are part of the equation. And I say, I know that this is an optimistic positioning today, but it is very sobering to speak to you in February of 2023 about the landscape in America around identity, around belonging, around the rise of hate, and around the us versus them ideologies that exist online and offline.
Thank you. I would like to continue on this because I don't think this is unique in the case of the United States. This also happened in Europe, in many Asian countries as well, the identity politics. But let me come back to you, Pak Trian. Yeah. Again, we heard that so depressing situation in many countries. Yeah, but honestly speaking, I was quite surprised that we were able to deliver the leaders' communique during the G20. Yeah, how Indonesia could bridge this, the fragmented world into this unity during the G20. You are the man behind the scene. Do you mind to share the recipe, the secret, the story behind it?
Well, thank you very much, Pak Hati, for giving me a much easier question than Farah. To be frank, that is much more tougher in a sense. And just to correct you on that, I'm not the man behind it. The success of G20 belongs to the people of Indonesia. That is one thing that I want to make it clear. Because there are 449 meetings. It's 449 meetings in the course of 1 year. It's in more than 20 cities in Indonesia. It shows that Indonesia is large, 17,000 islands. We are safe, we are healthy, and we are open for business. So that was the messaging that we are trying to. And that we started with only 3 priorities. First, on the question of the health pandemic, and then the priorities on transforming the digital, and then energy transition. But you know what happened 24 of February 2022? There was this invasion, and everything became a roller coaster. And that is where the case when you have the multilateral system is under attack. All international organization was really, I shouldn't use this word, but becoming not working. And our messaging is quite simple in our presidencies. Look, and this we do through a lot of lobbying, a lot of, at the different level, President Jokowi went to Kiev and Moscow Mind you, not many people know, Pak Chatib, that we're the only country that is accepted to Kiev back to Moscow. Can you imagine? And that shows against our foreign policies that we have always been a non-aligned country. We did the lobbying at Minister Retno level, at other ministers, Minister Mulyani, at my level. We gave the message, a simple message to everyone. To have G20 becoming G19 or G18 is not an option. We have to preserve G20 because this is the only organization or forum that really are geared toward the response to global crisis. And that's how we need to really say, after the dust settles down, you need only the G20 to make sure that everything goes well with the global economic system. So we make sure that everybody comes, everybody participates, and we're bold enough to invite the Ukraine without anyone's permission. And we told people, look, how could you not settle problems if everyone is not in the room? And alhamdulillah, during the ministerial meeting, foreign minister meeting of July, every minister came. That was a blessing. And in the past, can you imagine, even though there was no war, there are lots of ministers that didn't come to previous presidency. This shows that they have confidence in Indonesia. This shows once again that we are a country that have really a good credibility. And gearing toward the leaders' declaration itself, we make sure that, look, every time we host, Indonesia is very good at hosting meeting. And Bali, of course, I don't know, the mysticism of Bali always brings people together, and you always have consensus, whether it's the onset conference, whether in other kind of conference. But we make sure that, look, maybe we're not a good English speaker, but we're a good listener. So we listen to everyone. We listen to everyone concerned. We put it in the paragraph. Indonesia is famous for that. I don't know, my colleague around here can correct me on that. The second thing is that we have credibilities. We have always been impartial, and our foreign policy is always geared toward finding solution. We have never been part of the problem, but we're always part of the solution. And we give the simple message, look, if we fail coming up with the leaders' declaration, what is at stake is the global economy. Because once again, it's not only wording, it is address the issue. People always say that the leaders' declaration is always geared toward the Ukraine issue. No. There are 52 substantive paragraphs, 17 pages, talking about the climate change, talking about energy, education, everything. And everything is substantive, including debt for developing countries. But we make sure that the content really is also having a consensus. And we created, in the negotiating process, Pak Chatib, I created the sofa talk, where only the bosses sit. No secretariat, no staff, no nothing. And this is a normal Indonesian way of musyawarah, mufakat. We sit together, we have coffee in the warung. What is warung in English? Well, anyway, the coffee shop and old traditional. And we throw out our heart. We talk really openly. What do you want on this Black Sea Deal initiative? What do you want to address this debt issue? And then we finished the leaders' declaration way before the summit. Wow. Pak Chatib was a Sherpa in the old days. And I remember every time presidency is 2 hours before the closing of the summit. So we made the milestone in having that. But to sum up, I think if you ask me what would be the success story of the ingredients, is that we are respected. We have always been not party to any alignment here and there. We bring the spirit of developing countries. We try to find solution. And mind you, we are the first presidency that brought the other countries outside G20 that are never been part of the discussion. Yeah. We bring in the Pacific Island countries, the CARICOM countries. We are giving the messaging like, look, the small island countries has always been affected by climate change, affected by many conflicts, but they were never part of the conversation. So Indonesia, as the creator of the Bandung Conference, the non-aligned movement, the founders, we make sure that the G20 should not only be for the G20, but for the rest of the world. And we were the first one that created not only papers, but concrete program, concrete project. Never before. And the concrete things, if we come up with 361 concrete projects that G20 will be doing, not only for G20, but for the rest of the world. I think I said my piece.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pak Trian. I wish we can continue our discussion because this is so interesting. The world is so uncertain and fragmented, and this gives me a justification not to sum up our discussion. because a lot of uncertainty. But I believe that this is a very rich discussion and very useful to all of us. With that note, I would like to conclude, and I would like to thank, and I would like to invite to give a round of applause to our speakers. So thank you very much, Sir Ivan, Ms. Pandith, and Pak Trian. Thank you very much.
Again, please give big round of applause to our moderator, Bapak Chatib Basri, and all